introduce the TOEFL in case some people aren't familiar about it, or familiar with it, sorry. It is the test of English as a foreign language, and it's accepted by most American universities because most American universities require international students to submit some kind of proof of English proficiency. So that may be TOEFL, that may be a different test, but TOEFL is definitely the most widely accepted and most geared towards American colleges. So this is what the TOEFL looks like broken down as the entire test. It's a pretty long test, as you can see. It tends to vary. There's a lot of questions. Again, today we're going to be talking about listening and speaking. If you look at the chart, listening is going to take between 41 and 57 minutes, depending on how many questions there are going to be. So between 28, 39, tend to vary per test. And this section is going to be mostly focusing on answering questions about lectures or classroom discussions. So this is, as you can see, much more academic. And so that's what we're going to be going over today. After the 10-minute break, you can see that the speaking test is the shortest test out of the entire exam. You're going to get 17 minutes to complete 4 tasks. And these are a little bit different than listening because you can talk about a familiar topic depending on the prompt. You might be required to read and listen to something and respond to it verbally. Okay, so just to start, we're going to start with listening. So we're going to look at the structure a little bit more close up. Like I said, it's 41 to 57 minutes, but it's a little bit less than an hour, but it's going to be very packed with a lot of information. So you're going to have 3 to 4 lectures to listen to. Each of them are 3 to 5 minutes long. Seems kind of short, but after you do 3 or 4 of those, that's a lot of listening. That's around 20 minutes. And then you're going to get 6 questions per lecture to answer. So what you might be listening to will be conversations. You'll get 2 to 3. These conversations will be between 2 speakers. Each will be 3 minutes long, and you'll have 5 questions to answer per conversation. If you look down at the bottom of the slide, you can see that they are organized a little bit differently. Conversations tend to be less formal. This is something that is very likely to occur if you study in the United States and you need to go to a professor for office hours, or you have to talk to someone at a library. These are the informal day-to-day conversations that just happen around campus. On the other hand, the lectures are much more formal, much more academic. There might be terms that are more specialized to whatever the lecture is talking about that day. It can be from a bunch of different backgrounds and fields of study, which you don't need to have background information to do well on the test. But if you do want to practice on your own, it will be good to diversify what you're listening to. Listen to something about the arts, the physical sciences, whatever it is, just to get used to how professors lecture in class, and so that you're not thrown off guard if you're given a topic that you're not familiar with on the day of the exam. General tips and strategies for completing the listening section. Just a PSA, just right from the get-go, you'll only hear each clip once. Kind of daunting, especially if you don't catch something. That's why we really encourage that you take notes as you listen to the lecture. Make sure that you try to get down the biggest ideas, what the lecture is actually trying to say or what the conversation is really about. And the most important details, of course, you might miss a little thing here and there, but that's totally okay. As long as you get the main idea of the discussion, you should be able to formulate a good enough response. Another tip is to listen to signals that will help you make sense of what they're talking about or what the lecture is about. So think of transition words, think of how they connect ideas. Maybe if you start to study transition words a little bit more, you'll be able to identify when there's a shift in topic, especially in lectures or in a conversation if people start to disagree with each other or agree with. These are things that you want to keep in mind so that you identify them as soon as you hear it. Also pay attention to intonation and how the speaker conveys what they're thinking or conveys what they're feeling at the moment. A lot of times, just in any language, right? Some people say something and that's not exactly what they mean. People can say something to be polite, but they might not actually be feeling like they want to, or that might not actually be what they're trying to say. That is very common in English. You hear that all the time. So just pay attention to the way that they're saying things. Try to get used to that kind of intonation so that you're able to identify those too. Okay, some key things to recognize as you listen to excerpts. Pay attention to new words or concepts introduced by the professor. These concepts will often be in the questions that follow the listening excerpt. Again, this is to pretty much imitate what you'll be experiencing in a university classroom. And these are the kind of concepts that you're going to have to write down while you're listening to your professor lecture. And so this is just a mirror image of that. Once you answer a question, you can't go back to it. That is something you definitely want to keep in mind because that is not the case in other sections of the TOEFL. For example, in the reading section, you can just star it. You can mark the question if you're taking too long or it's a challenge for you and you could always go back and answer it. That is not the case for listening, so don't make that mistake. And just as a general tip, if you don't know where to start with broadening what you listen to practice for this test, a few good ways to practice for the listening section is to look up English lectures from the university websites of any university or maybe the universities you're interested in. There are tons of resources on YouTube. You can look up TED Talks. You can pick topics that you enjoy. You can pick topics that you're not familiar with. But those are all really good resources for the kind of information that you might see on the test. Okay, so let's get into questions. So the questions tend to vary for the listening section. Here are some types. You will have multiple choice questions with 4 answer choices, but only 1 is correct. You will also have multiple choice questions where more than 1 answer may be correct. These ones will be marked and will tell you to select more than 1. And you might also have questions where you'll have to organize some things that are said in the lecture or in the conversation, maybe chronologically, or to organize them based on opinion or whatever it may be. They're just questions that are a little bit more conceptual. And then also questions that might make you match objects or text to categories that are in a table that they present you with. So again, just a more conceptual, bigger idea kind of question. And as you can see, a lot of these are similar to other sections of the TOEFL too. Okay, so this is what a question might look like on the test. So this one has 1 correct answer. It looks like, just from glancing at the answer choices in the question, the text was probably some sort of lecture about plants, about the details of something that has to do with plants. So you'll go through these answer choices and pick only 1 correct answer, and hopefully you can tell from your notes which one was the correct one. Okay, and then the other type of multiple choice question will have multiple answers. As you can see in the italics, it says choose 2 answers. So this question, according to the professor, what 2 factors contributed to this discovery of the asteroid Ceres? So yeah, again, hopefully from your notes, this will probably be one of the main ideas of the actual lecture. These are things to kind of keep in mind. They're asking you for the main ideas because the lecture was most likely about the asteroid and developed these ideas further. So again, this is just what it'll look like on test day. Okay, so putting in order events or steps in a process. What was the order of actions that Mary used to try to solve her problem before talking to her advisor? So just making sure that you understand what happened in the conversation chronologically, and making sure that you understood the progression of the conversation as it went on. So hopefully in this conversation, those tips again with looking for transitions or talking about a problem, offering solutions, those are kind of triggers that you can recognize and be able to write down before the listening section is over. Okay, so a little bit more detail of the kind of questions that they may ask. They will ask for basic comprehension, which is, do you get the purpose of the text? Do you understand what it's about? Or sorry, the lecture, do you understand what it's about? Some of the main details of it, again, the little details, not so much, but the main details of it. Pragmatic understanding, so beyond basic understanding, why was this said? Why did the professor introduce this in the lecture? Or if, again, like I use the example of someone being polite, understand, well, okay, well, was this person being just polite, or are they meaning what they're saying? They're trying to make sure that you understand those differences in intonation. And then connecting information, like we were just talking about with the understanding the organization of the lecture, the conversation, and making sure that you can follow the logical flow of it and hopefully connect the ideas. Okay, so looking at basic comprehension, just like we were talking about, main ideas, they may be explicit, there may be implicit, but regardless, they should have been addressed in some way in the listening section. So that's another way to narrow it down. They require you to generalize and or synthesize information. So again, information that was presented in the lecture, obviously, they might try to actually trick you by putting in information that's not as relevant and trying to get you to think that that was an answer choice. But just like the other sections of the TOEFL, all of the answer choices have to be able to be traced back to some evidence in the actual listening section. And obviously for this one, it's a little bit more difficult because you only listen to it once, but choices that tend to refer to small portions of the clip, things that aren't that important, that are kind of forgettable, those typically don't turn up in questions. So you don't have to worry about memorizing every single thing that they talk about. So a few examples. What is the problem that this person has? Are they looking for directions? Did they get a bad test did they get a bad test grade? Are they returning a library book? What are they talking about? And then what is the lecture mainly about? Is it about stars? Is it about art? Is it about a certain artist? Is it about dance? More straightforward questions like that. And then with pragmatic understanding, understanding why something was said or what effect that the phrase has. These questions ask about a speaker's purpose or attitude. It may not be expressed directly, so this is something that you might have to infer. So yeah, ask yourself, what is the speaker actually trying to say? Even if they say one thing, is that what they're trying to say in the long run? So a few examples. What does the professor imply when he says this? And then here where it says replay, they might actually give you part of the clip to listen to again. So at least in these kind of questions, you'll have that second chance of really focusing on that small excerpt. The other example, what is the purpose of this woman's response? And then again, you'll get the opportunity to listen to the excerpt again and really focus in on how to answer the question. Okay, looking at connecting information a little bit more closely. You're supposed to make connections between the information that's given to you. So translating what's said to you and turning it into understanding. You're going to identify and explain relationships among ideas in details. You might be asked about the overall organization of listening to the passage. So again, not really what the passage is about, but understanding, okay, how was this listening passage organized? How does it flow? Why was it said in this order? Here's a list of signal words that will be useful for you to be able to identify transitions in the conversation or in the lecture that will likely show up in the question. So first, next, then, before, for example, for instance, in conclusion, all of those words, keep your ears open, write down the main ideas that tend to follow those words. So a few examples, how does the professor organize the information about X, whatever they're talking about in the lecture? What is the likely outcome of doing procedure X before procedure Y? So if it's about a science experiment, they'll probably explain to you why X needs to happen before procedure Y, and then you'll be regurgitating that information. Or you might be placing info into a chart based on organization or based on organized categories that TOEFL will provide for you. So just an example of the chart question. Just looking at this chart that's being displayed, we are obviously looking at different kinds of creatures and whether they're asymmetrical, they have radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry. So these are the kinds of things where, like, for example, I would have no idea just looking at this I don't have any background information looking at this, but this is the information that'll be presented in the lecture, and you'll be able to categorize it. And again, you don't have to have a ton of background knowledge to be able to answer these questions. You just have to be good at identifying what is said in the lecture and then translating that into the test questions. So because I'm unable to play a clip, here is a transcript of a lecture. So I'll go through it real quick. The artwork was meant to shock the public by presenting the ridiculous, absurd concepts. At the time, many people reacted to Dadaism by saying that the works were not art at all. And in fact, that's exactly how Duchamp and others conceived of it, as a form of non-art or anti-art. Duchamp was challenging the established cultural standards of his day. So the follow-up question is, what does the professor imply about the philosophy of the Dada movement? Let's go through the answer choices real quickly. It was not taken seriously by most artists. It varied from one country to another. It challenged people's concept of what art is, or it was based on a realistic style of art. Obviously, in the real test, you can't go back to the excerpt unless they offer it in the actual questions. I'm gonna just go back to the excerpt real quick. Just give the answer away, my bad. And once it comes up on the display, I don't think it's working. Okay, well, anyway, based on the language that was used in the excerpt, we can tell that it challenged people's concept of what art is. And I would go back to the excerpt if I could, but a few key words were that it challenged people's beliefs. It was revolutionary. It was difficult for people to grasp. None of those descriptions really fit as well with the other answer choices. Okay, let's move on to speaking. So speaking, this is how it's organized. You will have 4 tasks, like I mentioned in the beginning. Speaking is to test your ability to communicate and understand academic situations inside and outside the classroom. Conversations and lectures based on are based on actual speech that is used in North American colleges and universities. And so again, you have that mirror of what studying in the US is actually going to be like, and they're testing your capacity to be able to participate in the same situations. It'll be 20 minutes long, or 17, and it'll be 6 questions. The first task will be independent, so that'll be presenting your own thoughts and opinions based on a question that they give, and you will have to provide evidence of some sort and explain why you think what you do. And then the rest of the tasks will be integrated tasks where you will have to either read or you'll have to listen to something and then respond to that. Okay, so some tips in preparation for speaking. Obviously, you need to practice talking, practice speaking whenever you can, either by yourself, with friends, just to get used to articulating your thoughts in English. And because, test day can be scary. So as the more that you do it, the less weird it's going to feel on the actual test day. Record yourself while you practice speaking out loud. Listen to it again. Notice what words you struggle with, what kind of concepts you have a hard time talking about on the spot. That's also a really good way. Deliver the message through specific and concise language. So if you record yourself and you listen to the playback and you realize that you're having a hard time really getting to the point in some part of your response, practice making it shorter and using language that is more specific, because you only get so many minutes to be able to prepare and to speak your response. And so specific and concise language, if you get the hang of that, that's really, really key in a timed test like this. Develop the topic you're speaking about through examples and transition statements. So again, organize your response. Make sure that you have a beginning, a body with your evidence and your conclusion. The beginning and the conclusion don't have to be that long. It'll just be smoother. It'll get you a higher score for making it sound a little bit more organized. Also pay attention to the verb tense of the question. If it is asking you about something that you did in your past, super, super easy to, if you're stressed, to kind of overlook those kind of details, but make sure that you're answering in the correct verb tense, or else it might signal to the person grading that you didn't understand the question in its entirety. Okay, so how can you get that good score in a very small time frame? Try to write something down before the recording starts, before your response starts. It can be whatever you're comfortable with. An outline is good, even if you need to provide evidence for why you have to answer, you have to respond. And you can just write down the evidence pieces, and then just by memorizing those transition words, memorizing how to open your response and how to close your response. Those you can make up on the spot. They're not as important. But the evidence and explaining yourself, make sure that's organized, because that's ultimately the most important piece of your response. And it's okay to improvise. You're actually supposed to show that you're not reading. So you don't even have enough time to really write down your entire response. That's why, again, I'm emphasizing how important it is to really memorize things like transitions and openers and closing thoughts, so that you don't have to spend as much time on writing those down or anything like that. So it's totally okay to use fillers as you're talking. You want it to sound natural and not like you're reading from a paper. And this is another important tip, especially if you're under pressure. It doesn't matter whether your answer is true, especially for the questions asking you for your own opinion. What matters is that you present your argument thoroughly in a logical way. So if they're asking you about a personal preference and you don't even have enough information to really support your personal opinion, choose the easier side. It's okay. They're not going to judge you as long as you can support it. That is definitely the most important thing in this context. Always pay attention to the time remaining. If you have 60 seconds to go over or to respond, you don't want to run out of time, of course. And you also don't want to be sitting there with 20 seconds left. The way that the test is structured, you should be able to give a concise and thorough response in the time that they give you to be able to respond. And so make sure you try to fill it as best you can without going over it. Because they're not, if they wanted you to speak for 2 minutes, they would give you 2 minutes to speak. Practice your pronunciation and your tones, especially as well. These will help your speaking come more natural. Obviously with pronunciation, this is pretty self-explanatory, but if they can't understand you, they can't grade you. So these are also important things to consider as you're practicing. Okay, so let's look at the independent task, the one about your personal preference. You have 15 seconds to prepare. Not a lot of time at all. Jot something down though. You need to use this 15 seconds before you start to speak. Don't just assume that because it's too short, you can't get anything of substance on your paper. Then you'll have 45 seconds to respond. You will choose your preferred option out of the information presented. And again, focus on making your ideas flow and connect to one another and make sense. So this is this is an actual prompt that I took off of the TOEFL website. Some people enjoy taking risks and trying new things. Others are not as adventurous. They are cautious and prefer to avoid danger. Which behavior do you think is better? Okay, in situations like this, you have 15 seconds after you see this to write down everything that you think you can say. Write down the argument that comes to mind first, flesh that out, and then respond. You don't have time to decide which one you like better, whatever it is. Even if it's not what you actually believe, just get something down. Okay, let's look at the integrated tasks. So you will have 30 seconds to prepare, a little bit more, and 60 seconds to answer. You'll be given a passage to read, and you will have to listen to a conversation about the topic. And in your response, you'll be explaining the opinion presented in what you listened to and how it relates to the opinion of what's written in the passage that you just read. So that means that you're listening to the main purpose of the passage, the audio clip, and you're trying to get the gist of the main passage that you're reading as well. So no space to insert your opinion. You're strictly just talking about the relationship between the text that you're given and the audio clip that you're given. And then just a reminder that the tests are designed for you to be able to answer completely and thoroughly in the 60 seconds given. And so keep an eye on the clock to make sure that you're not going over or that you're leaving too much of the clip silent. Okay, so the next integrated task question, same thing, you'll get 30 seconds to prepare, 60 seconds to answer. This one will be a little bit different because as the last one could be more informal, this one will likely be an academic passage. You'll listen to a lecture that might be taken from a classroom, and it might be about an academic term or concept you can find in a textbook that you might not be familiar with, just like in other sections of the exam. And then you'll also be given an excerpt to read that'll explain a term or a concept, whereas the lecture might elaborate a little bit more in the details or the examples. A lot of the information will overlap, which is good in case you don't if you miss some of the details in one of them, hopefully you'll be able to make up for reading the passage or getting in the lecture. Hopefully two things that are talking about the same thing you'll be able to kind of put together a story from those two and answer the questions. So in the questions to follow, question 3, you will be asked about certain examples used in the listening or in the audio clip or in the lecture that you were given to, or the text you were given to read to get the gist of the passage. And you'll also be asked to make connections between the lecture and the reading. So maybe certain positions on the material, maybe if the lecture elaborates a little bit more, what kind of information it offers that the reading doesn't, and vice versa. Okay, moving on to the next question. You'll have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to answer. There is a trend with a minute to answer each one of these. You're going to listen to a lecture, and summarize the lecture. You will have an excerpt of an academic lecture on a single topic. So at least in this one, you don't have another text to worry about. And it's typically a professor defining something, highlighting an issue, talking about something academic. And you will just have to summarize the lecture. So in this, because you only have one audio clip to kind of base your response on, it's definitely important for you to get used to practicing questions like this, where you only listen to it once and have to jot down the main ideas, since in the first task, you got to actually make up information to put in your response. This one has to be very tied to what you listen to. It's not asking for your opinion, it's asking for what you just heard and for you to regurgitate the same information. So let's just look at the kind of stuff that they will be asking, just to go off of what I was just kind of talking about. You'll be asked to explain, obviously, the main concept or the issue of the lecture so that you can demonstrate that you understood it, that you can be in a North American classroom and absorb the information that's being talked at you from the professor. And you can use you're going to be summarizing the lecture in your own words. Of course, it's important to write down keywords if you can, and hopefully use the terms, maybe if they're new, the terms presented in the lecture, and to incorporate it into your response. But overall, this should be a summary of the lecture in your own words, so that you can demonstrate your unique understanding. So what do graders look for when they're listening to your recordings? They're looking for how well you deliver your material. So how well you communicate your thoughts. Is it clear? Is it organized? Are you pronouncing things in a way that they can understand? Is the pace of your response natural, or does it sound like you're reading? And also, are you using good intonation? So making sure that your tone matches your response and whatever you're saying. Language use, of course. So are you using language and vocab, the correct language and vocab to express your ideas accurately? So this is probably not the time to throw in those new vocab words that you think you have a grasp on, but you're not totally sure what they mean and what their connotations are. This is not totally the time to be creative. So you stick to words that you know, even if they're more simple than other words that you'd like to use. The importance is that you use them correctly and that you use them in a way that accurately expresses your thoughts. And so accuracy is totally key here. Don't try anything fancy that will possibly bring the score down, especially if it's an easy point and you can use language that you already know very well. Then also topic development. So do you answer the question? That is super, super important, that I think a lot of people tend to not realize is as difficult, or they tend to realize is more difficult in a time situation. Also because speaking comes as a third section in the TOEFL test. And so even though you have a 10-minute break before, you were already sitting in a room for 2.5 hours taking the other parts of the test. And so your mind is obviously going to be a little bit more tired. So make sure that you answer what they're actually asking you, even if that means rereading the question after you kind of outline your thoughts. That has to be accurate. How well do you express your ideas and support what you're saying? So if you answer with an opinion, or you answer that the lecture mentions these points, make sure that you have specifics to back up your claim and what you're trying to say. And then also, do your ideas connect? Did you put anything random in there that doesn't belong? Is it cohesive? Does it make sense to listen to? Those are all really important for graders for you to score higher. Okay, so these are some tips from ETS. ETS is the organization that designs the TOEFL and writes the TOEFL. So to get better at the speaking section and all parts of the TOEFL, but these are their specific suggestions. Follow online newspapers from universities to get used to wording used at universities. And so, like I've mentioned, is a common theme throughout the lecture, or my presentation today, is that the whole point of listening and speaking is to evaluate your ability to be in a college classroom, to be on a college campus, and to talk to professors, your peers, librarians, whoever it is. These are all to imitate what it's actually going to be like for you when you step foot on a university campus. And so one way to really get used to the language they might use, or so be it, one way to really refine your knowledge or your vocabulary is to follow online materials from actual universities, so that you're at least studying information, or you're familiarizing yourself with information from the same sphere. And along that vein, also looking up articles that discuss campus life. So maybe about clubs, or maybe about what it's like to eat in a dining hall. Those kinds of things that describe campus life, for you to have that background knowledge when you are approaching the listening and speaking sections. So again, I know that's pretty broad, because campus life can be a lot of things, but especially because these sections are more academically oriented, starting from sources that come from actual colleges and universities. That's a really, really good tip to be able to at least have some kind of background knowledge of campus life when you take the TOEFL. And this is a repeated tip, but still just as important and necessary. Record yourself as you practice and listen to yourself speak. If you're anything like me, I hate listening to myself over recordings. However, that is the only way that I get better at the languages I'm studying, Portuguese being one of them, because I, as a native English speaker, I cannot pronounce half of the words in Portuguese correctly. And so that is a really unfortunate but really helpful way for me to really catch my mistakes, see what words I'm struggling with, or what kind of topics I'm trying to conceptualize or communicate that are not going so well, and I could refine a little bit more. Especially since maybe this is your case too, but I don't exactly have that many people to practice with here, so I can't have like a friend correcting me on the spot or anything like that. Find reading and listening material that discuss the same topic, and then do these exercises on your own. So we've already seen that a lot of the questions that you're going to be answering, actually the majority of the tasks, are going to be based on reading and listening material on the same academic topic. You're going to have to be able to extract information from reading and extract information from audio clips in a very short time period. So if you're struggling to find practice tests or figuring out how to do this on your own, try finding this material. It's very available on the internet if you are interested in learning about something in your field, something outside of your field. You can find information, maybe a TED Talk and also an article, and then think about, okay, they're about the same topic, but how do these two sources disagree with each other? What do they have in common? Does one bring up a point that the other one doesn't? you can totally do that on your own. And then just a reminder, it's testing your ability to articulate in English and not your knowledge about the topic. So don't be intimidated if it's a topic that you're not familiar with, because they're not testing you on being an astrology expert, as long as you're able to communicate what the audio clip was saying or what the passage was about. And then if you have time left over, a common mistake that people do is to just repeat themselves, but that's actually making your response more disorganized. So try to speak intentionally. And that's why by practicing your speech at home and recording it, you can actually tell how long it takes for you to respond to something. And if you're like me, who talks a lot, I need to record myself and cut myself off. So that really makes me I need to make my words a little bit more concise and specific to fit in that time frame. So every word needs to be intentional. And I mean, if you have 5 seconds left, that's really not that much. And you feel like you've delivered all the information you need to, then that's fine. But if you feel like you need to fill up every single second, you don't have to. Make sure that your ideas are well developed and then move on. And then this last bullet right here is just the website to ETS with all the TOEFL information. Okay, so some general tips for studying from the TOEFL, which overlap a lot with what we talked about yesterday with reading and writing, but are just as important. Exposing yourself to academic English, especially, which is also important in the other sections of the TOEFL, but arguably most important in listening and speaking that we're talking about today. Because again, TOEFL is centered on your ability to succeed in English in a university environment and ability to comprehend academic texts. Get used to reading and listening to stuff about university environments and academic texts. So while you may listen to music and to movies and TV to kind of keep your English up, especially if you don't have many people to practice with, that's awesome, but that's not going to be super helpful if you're reading a text about whatever it is and it's in formal English with not as much. It's going to be harder to understand. So a few really good sources for this is to look for news sources such as BBC, NPR, real textbooks. You can watch movies about American university life to get the gist of it. That's okay. Most of these are going to get you used to a North American accent, but obviously because any kind of English help is helpful, you can read or listen to anything from anywhere. That's more academic. And if you are struggling to, or if you want to brush up on vocab specifically used in the TOEFL, here's a really helpful link for words that come across the TOEFL a lot. So just so that you don't have to stress about some words that are common in English, but you might not totally understand or know how to use. Here is a really good list to use so that you don't have to worry about that on test day. You already have those words mastered, and it just makes the test go that much faster if you don't have to sit there and try to contemplate what a word means or what you think it means. And then some general bonus tips, just because it didn't fit all in one slide. Practice the types of questions that you struggle with. So obviously the only way that you're going to be able to tell what you struggle with is by practicing these sections in your own home, timed or not timed, although when you get closer to test day, it'll actually really help if you force yourself to take the test timed. And if you want to try timing yourself for a full section, that's super helpful, or the whole practice test. I mean, I know that's super time consuming and you might not have the time to do that regularly, but that is very recommended. And I can't even emphasize how tired you might get by the last section, which I think the last section is writing, which we didn't talk about today, but still, you need to get used to kind of an overload of testing or an overload of information so that you don't burn out in the last half, which is speaking and writing. And then, of course, answer every single question, especially because in listening, you can't go back to re-answer questions. Answer every question because you will not lose points for answering a question wrong. So just answer every single question no matter what to up your chances of getting the answer right, even if you have no idea what the correct answer is. Okay, and then here is a slide with a lot of useful links. There are quite a lot of them, but they will be super useful for practicing for the TOEFL more in depth or for getting any information a little bit more in depth that I didn't go over here. So I'll leave this slide up, but I will open the floor to questions. If you either want to drop them in the chat or to ask, you can ask in English or Portuguese. I will answer in English, but yeah, so does anyone have any doubts that I can clear up?
And all feel free to turn on your cameras and just ask directly or put it in the chat. Will we receive the slideshow? Yes, we are going to upload this to our YouTube channel. So just look there. The presentation from yesterday is already there, so you can already check that out. Any other questions? How do you recommend to take notes in the listening section?
Sure. So I think the main thing to stress for listening, especially since you only hear the audio clip once, is to write down the main ideas as you're listening to it. Shortened versions, or just small notes, whatever is easiest for you to understand as you go back to it while you're answering the questions. That's why another tip that I mentioned earlier was to really try to get good at identifying transition words where there might be a transition between ideas or between main concepts, anything new that they may introduce where it's like however, or for example, or first, especially if the lecture is explaining something that needs to happen in a chronological order. So understanding those kind of transition words will help you identify when there's a change of ideas, whether there's a point of contention in the conversation. So however is easiest for you to take notes where you want to understand later, but I would emphasize being able to identify those main ideas and writing them as you're listening. Don't wait until later because it's like 3 to 5 minutes long. You don't want to internalize all that information. I hope that answers your question.
I can tell you from personal experience that it's very easy to get distracted in the listening section. You really should try to avoid that. So really pay close attention. As knowing that you can't really go back to it. So be very careful with what you're listening to and write it down since you're not going to get a second chance on that section.
I can imagine. Lectures are very hard to listen to, especially online.
It's very hard, and especially on a Saturday morning when I did it, it wasn't easy. So everyone, that's a good tip is like try to stay awake and paying attention, very alert to everything that's happening. Don't get distracted by like a fly that's flying by or anything like the person next to you. So be careful with that.
Yeah, and this is just to add on to that. These are experiences that you can recreate in your home So the more that you get used to disciplining yourself during these practices, the easier it'll be on actual test day. So get used to that discipline so you don't have to be stressing about it on the day of. Here's another question.
And then there's a question about the more common topics for the speaking section. Are they more common topics or more serious topics?
Yeah, so just from looking at examples of questions that they ask for that independent task, which is the one where you offer your opinion, they tend to be they don't tend to be topics where you have to think about it all day in order to offer a very serious, well thought out response. And so if you mean serious topics, maybe things pertaining to more serious things like politics or your opinion on world peace or global warming, anything like that, they tend to be more everyday things that you might talk to your friends about. Like, there's another example that I can think of that I read. Like, do you think that preparing food, or because preparing food is easier these days, is that worse for our society or is that better for our society? Those very everyday kinds of things that you probably are able to respond to in that small amount of time that they give you to talk about whatever your opinion is or whatever argument that you're supporting. I hope that answers that. Okay.
Yeah, I think don't really what we're working on in our like high school standardized tests in Brazil, that we get like the very deep questions about, I don't know.
Oh, interesting.
What's your opinion on them in your country or something like intense like that, or how does it work? They're going to be more common questions that you don't really have to spend a whole hour thinking about what you're going to be answering.
Those are deep questions. Wow.
Well, we have the Enem test in Brazil, our version of the SAT, and they're very deep questions. You really have to actually think about it. Do we have any final questions? No? Okay. Well, if anyone has any questions that you think about later, please feel free to contact us at EducationUSA. We are going to upload this video on our YouTube page. We have also a lot of other videos there. We have an event called Plantão de Dúvidas, which you can talk to an advisor. It happens a couple of times a week. So if you think of any questions you have after this presentation, you can also join us for that event and just ask whatever you need to. I would like to thank Noelani for the presentation. It was great again, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Get out of this.